right, guys, welcome to the Adam Peeler Fitness podcast. Today on the show, I have Zach Robinson and is it Josh? Josh, what's your last name? This is already
Come
awkward.
on, man, sound it out. Let's go. Let's hear it.
Josh, I'm looking up your handle, Josh Helland.
There you go.
You're Josh Pelland. So both they are better known as Data Driven Strength on the Instagrams and the social medias. And they currently work at FAU, Florida Atlantic University, which is a freaking awesome exercise science lab under the tutelage of Mike Zordos for, is it your master's right now?
For me, it's my master's. Zach. Zach's moving on to the next level here in a little bit.
That's pretty. That's pretty awesome. So they're both really smart guys. They've put out a lot of some really good content. Johnny Candido has talked a lot about them. He's been a guest. They've been guests on basically any powerlifting coaches or nerd podcasts or channels because they know their stuff. They're really smart. And I guess on this podcast, we're kind of just going to dive into how basically putting more options back on the table for programming for powerlifting instead of having like a dogmatic approach with just there's like one way to do things. So talk a little bit more about the nuance of what we mean about that. So I guess before we continue, I want to give Josh and Zach a chance to talk about themselves if they feel they need to.
Oh man, that you're going to give us an out with the last bit there. Yeah. I think the very short and sweet of it is we really like lifting weights, and like you said, kind of like they've been diving into the nuance on things. Try to provide both the kind of the research lens, but also give a practical spin on that and make sure lifters can take stuff away from our content and not just talk about research with no practical basis. But I think that's pretty much all we need to say about ourselves. Josh, you concur?
No, man, that's about it. I mean, we always like to say that powerlifting found us. Like we didn't like get into powerlifting because we were like super interested in powerlifting in and of itself. We just enjoy lifting weights, and it turns out that powerlifting is pretty analytical. So, that's kind of how we ended up in this realm. But like Zach said, even though we do try to rely heavily on the evidence, and maybe we'll talk about this later in the show, we also like to acknowledge the limitations of the evidence and also provide practical spins and our opinions, given whenever there's a lack of evidence on a topic. So sometimes we probably miss the mark in terms of striking that balance, but we try to do our best.
I think that's a really a great point that you put there, because sometimes because of the nature of the evidence in powerlifting programming, especially since it's just it's in terms of research is universities and institutions are going to be less keen to put their money towards bros and sisters just trying to get yacked versus curing cancer, surprisingly. So a lot of it is kind of the pen light, like looking for just little signs, and lots of times guys on the front lines, coaches and whatnot, are their anecdotes and observations are just as good as a lab setting in a lot of cases, especially if that coach has lots of success with one certain way of programming or coaching. So yeah, I guess just to dive into things, you guys have developed a little bit of a reputation for being the low RPE guys, the guys that we don't really lift above like RPE 5 because I want to talk a little bit more of that nuance of it, because I think that lots of people have missed the mark with that, with interpreting your guys' work on that. For those of you who are a little bit unfamiliar, Zach and Josh have both put out some data on the utility of low RPE training to, I guess, enhance strength and also as a tool for hypertrophy as under the right context. So I guess I wanted to let you guys take the floor and just kind of discuss a little bit of your work, how you came into that theory, and then how you would apply that in practice in terms of like periodizing it over time. I guess like how much low RPE work is beneficial, and like how much can you progress as a power lifter with that without much top end exposure.
Yeah, I think it's important to start with kind of how we got to kind of talking about that. And so the first thing to keep in mind was kind of a narrative surrounding, the RPEs that are effective, quote unquote, for training. was kind of, you saw this range of 0 to 4 reps in reserve, or a 6 to 10 RP kind of being promoted as a set needs to be within this range to be considered effective, or can be considered a work set even. Something Josh and I often talk about is like in our intake forms for clients, when we were asking, what was the previous level of training volume that you were kind of doing in terms of sets per week. A lot of times they would only be reporting sets that were 6 and above. And, for a lot of context, that's probably not a terrible way of doing things, but we still think those a little bit lower RP sets still probably contribute to quote unquote effective training volume. So that was just kind of something we always talked about. But so that was kind of the narrative in the community that we found ourselves kind of, questioning a little bit. Now, that's not to say that that isn't a good practical recommendation, which we might come back to in the end in terms of some issues with RP accuracy, especially with lower RPEs. But in terms of a very specific cutoff of black or white, if a set's 5 RP, it's no longer effective. We were pretty skeptical of that claim. So we started to dig into the research a little bit on this topic, and end up finding that the waters are a lot murkier than it seems. And so kind of the best way to think about it is kind of looking at a set of 10 to failure is kind of from a practical perspective, the way we like to think about it. If I was going to take this load for 10 reps, so it's around 75% of 1 rep, the current narrative would kind of suggest you want to take that set to a point where the RP is somewhere in that range, right? 0 to 4 reps in reserve. But when we kind of look at the research from a practical perspective, it seems that you can kind of break that training volume up into pretty much any way you want, and still receive a majority of that strength stimulus. And we can talk about reasons why that may be in terms of like a theoretical model. But from a practical standpoint, if I can break up that work into more sets, those sets are going to be lower RPE, and I'm probably going to get less fatigue from that volume. And if I can maintain the effect, then that seems like a good trade-off. So that's kind of just the basic thinking on things. But a very, very important thing to note there is anytime we talk about that conversation, it's at a given load. So I'm not saying if we have a set of 10 to failure versus a set of 10 to 3 RPE, the set of 10 to 3 RPE is better. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if we have the exact same weight on the bar, so let's say 315 pounds, you could take it for that set of 10 to failure, or I could do 2 sets of 5 or 3 sets of 3 with that exact same weight, in which we think the latter was probably a little bit more efficacious for strength. So that's kind of the broad strokes there, in terms of kind of the way that we think about this stuff. And just an additional caveat, I'm going to let Josh kind of clean anything up I missed here, is that this is generally only for loads that are kind of moderate to heavy. So we're not advocating for people going and training with 30% of 1RM for powerlifting. Strength is a specific skill that, is measured in the context that we care about on the squat, bench, and deadlift for a 1 rep max. And those are going to be slow lifts that are really heavy. So we want to be up towards that moderate to heavy load range for a vast majority of our training. So when we kind of talk about this lower RPE stuff, just remember that's relative to those moderate and heavy loads that we're using. So like somewhere between 70 to 100% of 1RM. So Josh, take it from there. What I miss?
No, I echo everything you said, and I'll kick it over to you, Adam, here in a second. I just want to add 2 pieces of clarification that can sometimes be a little bit confusing, but it's a lot easier to explain in this context than on social media. So, like you said, Adam, like we kind of get labeled as advocating for low RP training, and that's kind of correct, but it's also kind of inaccurate. In terms of like what we're actually saying. We'll sometimes communicate it as low RPE because that resonates with a lot more people. But technically, what we're actually vouching for as an option to put back on the table is low intra-set fatigue training. So intra-set fatigue meaning the amount of fatigue accumulated within a set. So what that means is, like Zac said, if you have your 10 rep max load on the barbell, instead of doing sets of 8 or 9 with that, you can do the same total number of reps at that load with lower intra-set fatigue, so less reps per set, meaning you're basically more fresh for more reps, if you will, producing greater force, which is ultimately more specific for strength in regards to force production. Okay, so that's an important thing. It can manifest into lower RPEs, but it is technically lower intra-set fatigue that we're kind of making the case for. And also, just to really, really drive home a point that Zac said, is that we're not saying speed work with 45% of your 1 rep max. Load is very, very important. And we're talking about at a given load, right? So we wouldn't recommend to decrease load for the sake of lower intra-set fatigue, right? Those don't go together. We're saying at a given load, if you do not accumulate as much fatigue within the set, you're going to have greater force output, and you also might have downstream benefits in addition, right? You might have a great higher total volume tolerance either for that session or for your next session. You might be a little bit fresher for that next session, so your top set can be a little bit heavier, which is going to be beneficial from a just a motor learning perspective. So again, it's technically intra-set fatigue, but it can manifest into lower RPs.
Just real quick, Adam, sorry, and I'll let you talk here. Just a really easy practical example to illustrate that. If, again, like Josh said, if our given load, let's just say that's 85% of 1RM, the max amount of repetitions you can perform with 85% of 1RM is generally around 6 reps. So if we took that 6RM, well, one person that performs all 6 of those reps in one set, or a person that performs 2 sets of 3, the person performing 2 sets of 3 is still doing that work in that 0 to 4 RER range. So there's going to be about a 7 RP sets. But like Josh said, that's going to significantly limit the intra-set fatigue, which is ultimately what we're talking about. So it's not necessarily low RP for the sake of it. It's low RP because that often results from low intra-set fatigue at a given load.
Cool. So my main question about that, going off the whole intra-set fatigue question, if we're having a lower intra-set fatigue, would that mean that our overall cumulative fatigue from that training session would be lower, even if you're equating volume, or are we talking about purely just a little bit better intent during the sets and maybe a little bit better technical execution? Because how I kind of use this, I kind of took this away from you guys with a lot of my lifters, is I'll use that same thing, 75% plus, and I'm assuming that has to do with the fact that type 2 muscle fibers need a certain amount of load to actually come into the equation. But basically, like, able to get a little bit more specific practice, and maybe have a little more better intent on moving those reps as fast as possible, and treating every rep a little bit more like a single, especially like closer to competition after your top end strength. That's kind of how I've used it personally. Does that make sense?
I think that makes perfect sense. So basically, the way I interpreted that question is like, okay, like, what's the benefit here? What's the goal? Is it to like take a given dose of training and make it less fatiguing, or is it something intrinsic about these repetitions once they're broken up, right? So just like a basic example, instead of doing a set of 10, we're doing 3 triples, which, let's just say more or less that's the same volume, right? I think it's both. And Zac can correct me on the exact study details if I butcher them here, but a paper by Moran, Navarro and colleagues, 2016 or 2017, something like that. They looked at that exact question. So the number of repetitions at a given load was equated, but in one condition, I think it was 3 sets of 10 and 6 sets of 5 at the same load. And yes, markers of fatigue, I want to say 24 hours later, don't quote me on that, something like that, was lower. So yes, you will, with a given number of repetitions at a given load, by taking the strategy, you will probably see a decrease in fatigue, within the session as well as in the coming days. So that's one benefit. The other benefit is, like you said, Adam, I think that's a great point. It's just greater intent for those given repetitions. So that's really getting at force production. So this is a really, really intuitive concept, right? The first rep of a set, you can produce more force because you're less tired. This ultimately leads to a greater acceleration out of the hole, which manifests into higher barbell velocities. Again, we're talking at a given load, right? So each rep is kind of snappier because you're producing more force out of the hole. You can accelerate it quicker, and the velocity of the barbell is ultimately higher. So my answer to your question is yes, right? It's both. So yeah, I hope that answered your question. Zac, you can clean up any mess I made, and Adam, let me know if I missed the mark there.
No, I think that was perfect. I think the Moran Navarro study is exactly what I was going to bring up. Literally exactly looked at that question. And the way we often like to think about it is because you are sparing this fatigue, you often can replace that energy that you're saving somewhere else that probably matters more for strength in the short to moderate term. So the way that we often like kind of to phrase it is, when we get into these strength phases where we are using a lot of these low intra-set fatigue strategies, we're going to be saving that fatigue on on these back off sets. And so then we can put that replaced energy into the top sets so we can really aim to maximize peak intensity. And that seems to be pretty predictive of strength gains in the short to moderate term. So if we're really able to maximize our performance on those top sets, that's going to probably lead to good things.
Yeah, so just anecdotally, because like this is kind of the approach that my coach Eric Bother and I have with a lot of my top sets, because basically what I'll do is I'll do my top set, whatever, and then I used to, before Eric, I would basically take whatever down sets I had to pretty high RPEs, pretty high intra-set fatigue, because hashtag specificity. But it's an important caveat about that is that I don't think you can only do low RPE training and actually have that skill of a 1 rep max. I have some athletes that they get really beaten up by high intensity. Like I don't go above like really like, 80, 85% with them, but they're still going close to failure. So they kind of still get that feeling like, what does a grindy set feel like? But when I went to Eric's kind of more programming style, I noticed that by using a little more lower intra-set fatigue methods on down sets, in particular for my main volume work, my peak just seemed to be higher. When I came into my sessions, I seemed to be more ready. I felt like in every single set, I was less psychologically scared of the weight, because I was like, oh, like I'm going to get crushed by this, by the set of 5 with like 85% of my max. Whereas it's just like, well, maybe I can do 85%, but just do triples. And then that automatically makes it a lot easier. And then usually technique breakdown is a little bit less prone to happening, because I think lots of times people forget about the psychological components of, keeping that groove and really focusing on the set with heavy weights. Because if you have really heavy weight on your back, like Lane Norton says, he's just like 400 pounds always feels like 400 pounds on your back. It's just that your threshold gets higher. It just makes it a little bit less of a psychologically daunting task. For some lifters, however, I've seen the opposite be true, where just the number of on racks can be really fatiguing for somebody. Like if they look on their paper and they're like, oh, I have a 6x4 instead of a 4x6, they kind of like, okay, like crap. So how do you create buy-in to this? And like, how do you periodize this with lifters and decide? Because I'm sure that you guys aren't just like, well, we'll use this with all of our athletes no matter what. How would you periodize this and go about needs analysis?
So I'll jump in here and I want to touch on a quick practical piece from what you were discussing, Adam, which I totally agree with everything you were saying. But it is really important to point out that like we would really only take this approach in the presence of heavy top sets. If you forced me to not program top sets, I would probably not use low intra-set fatigue like volume work on the main lifts. Because so if we take that set of 10 to failure, we've kind of used that example. Yes, you have higher force production in the beginning of that set of 10 to failure, but at the end, you do get that feeling of grinding through reps of slower barbell velocities, which is important in order to learn how to grind through a 1 rep max and to be comfortable with that. But we would rather you do so with heavy loads on top sets. So again, it really works a lot better if you're programming top sets. I would be hesitant to just program these low intra-set fatigue strategies without any top sets in the week. So that's just one thing I wanted to touch on.
I'm going to be super pedantic and just mention that technically speaking, if you're doing a top single at a high RP, that's also low intra-set fatigue. So, but I totally agree. Like it's, you have to have, from a practical perspective, and every coach in the game would probably agree that you have to have some psychological exposure and physiological exposure to high RPEs. Our preference is just that comes with heavier loading rather than you just getting tired, because that's not actually what you're trying to do on the platform. If you were training for a 10 RM competition, that'd be different. And you'd probably want to actually do a 10 RM because you're actually training for a high intra-set fatigue event. But because a 1 RM isn't that, we probably want to err towards the load side of the equation rather than just fatigue.
So I'll circle back and actually answer your question here, Adam, about periodization. So from a high level, as a bit of a spoiler alert, we do think periodizing this strategy makes sense. That's not to say it doesn't have the conceptual framework that leads us to this conclusion as an option. It doesn't mean you can't use it year round, but just as like a general starting point, we do like to periodize our use of this. And ultimately, from a high level, the reasoning for that is the difference, the potential differences in outcomes between strength and hypertrophy. So from a strength perspective, we are quite confident that at a given load, if you break the work up into more sets, you're going to see at least equal strength gains. There's some indication maybe here and there in the research that you might see slightly better, but you're also going to have those downstream effects in terms of, potentially greater volume tolerance, et cetera. So from a strength perspective, we think this makes a lot of sense. We are a little hesitant from a hypertrophy. Sure I understand. Sorry, Siri just jumped in there. From a hypertrophy perspective, we're not quite as convinced that this is going to maximize hypertrophy in the long run. Do we think it's going to be night and day and that you're going to get absolutely zero hypertrophy from doing a bunch of triples instead of, sets of 6 RPA? No, it's not going to be night and day, but we do often like to emphasize that we think maximizing muscle size of the prime movers, so quads in the squat primarily, pecs in the bench press, again, primarily, glutes, hamstrings in the deadlift is going to be your best investment for long-term strength. And again, we're hesitant to sacrifice hypertrophy outcomes by taking this approach. So as kind of an insurance policy, when farther out from a peak or just, when you're not really in a strength biased block, we like to bias higher intra-set fatigue training. Just again, because the research is not super clear as to whether these strategies will maximize hypertrophy. So again, it's not going to be night and day, but just as a bit of an insurance policy. And also, it turns out that periodization is helpful for a lot of people from a psychological perspective. Hey, we're introducing these low fatigue strategies. All right, it's strength block time. Let's turn it on. Like that in and of itself can go a long way. So anyway, in short, the high level rationale for it is potential differences in strength and hypertrophy outcomes. Far out from testing, we're willing to give up some of those, short-term fatigue benefits to potentially get greater hypertrophy, but closer to a test, hey, we'll take that slightly worse hypertrophy in order for, heavier top set exposures, that kind of thing. So
I'll take the buy-in half of the question. So I think obviously we're biased to some degree. We've put out a lot of content about these strategies. So I think we have definitely a selection bias in terms of the clients that come to us to work with us, that they want to try a lot of the low fatigue stuff if they haven't already, or maybe they've already had positive experiences with it. So I think the initial buy-in from us is usually not a huge deal. But when we were originally starting this, I think even selling the idea that, hey, we can, do something that we think is going to spare fatigue and allow you to maximize performance on the heavy top sets. Generally, powerlifters are interested in lifting heavy weights, so it's usually not a hard sell. So that is generally a pretty easy way to get it off the ground. But the other question you asked was in terms of individualization. I think this is definitely something our thoughts of it have evolved on over time, the more practical experience that we've got with this. I think, early on, it was easy to kind of swing the sword of low fatigue and say everybody can benefit from low fatigue. Everybody's doing singles at 85%. And I think from a principle standpoint, I still think it's a great place to start for most people. And I think that's going to be something that, just like the other tenets of basic program design, we think it's kind of like, okay, you want to train for strength, you should probably train with heavy weights. What does heavy weights mean? That's individual specific, but it's similar with intra-set fatigue. Okay, you want to train for strength, you're probably going to have a lower intra-set fatigue. Exactly what does the lower mean? That's going to be individual specific. So the way that we've kind of started to think about this is like from that periodization model that Josh just laid out. Generally for strength, you're going to have some sort of increase in load over the course of the training cycle. And we think you're going to have some sort of decrease of intra-set fatigue over the course of the training cycle. Exactly where you're starting in terms of specifics, I have some athletes that end their training cycles at what I would call moderate to even slightly high intra-set fatigue, but that trend of what they're doing over the course of the training cycle is relatively similar to most people. Now, again, there's going to be individuals that maybe you just got to throw the equation out of the bathwater and just go with what works, and that's always going to be something that's just going to be a logistical reality with individualization. But kind of like you said, Adam, I think it's something not to be dogmatic about. There's a lot of things that can work. There's a lot of approaches that can work. And it's once you've kind of gotten this overall picture of the training dose, making sure volume's in a good spot, intensity's in the right spot, then you can start to mess some of the individualization with the intra-set fatigue stuff and kind of tweak that to the individual. But we think what we're presenting is a good place to start for most.
I think there's a lot of really, really great things to unpack there. My first question regarding the hypertrophy, we know that so mechanical detention is the primary driver of muscle growth. I'd be hard pressed to say that if you're not adding weight to the barbell or an accessory exercise, especially like a single joint isolation, you're probably not really getting that much bigger, not really, getting the hypertrophy benefits. The other are metabolic stress and muscle damage. Would you say, is it the reason why you're a little bit more in hypertrophy phases? You're going to focus a little bit more on, more, maybe like a 3x8 to RPE 8. Is that mainly because of those other factors that happen from hypertrophy standpoint with that fatigue that is accumulated?
So I can take this one, Josh, real quick, just because it's fresh on my mind. Been talking about this a lot recently. I think mostly if we look at the research on a few things that we're particularly uncertain about, when we train, in these studies, what we're primarily looking at is the prime movers and at one specific site of those muscles. So when we're doing a study, let's say one group does 4 sets of 10, another group does 8 sets of 5. We're looking at bench press and pec growth. We're looking at one spot on the pecs with a multi-joint exercise. And so the uncertainty there is generally we don't measure multiple sites of that muscle. And when we do, there is some data to say that groups training closer to failure seem to have more well-rounded hypertrophy. So in addition to that, when we're training compound movements, there's no guarantee either that the synergistic muscles like the triceps and the bench press, glutes and the quads, glutes and the squat, things like that, aren't receiving a sufficient hypertrophic stimulus when we are training far from failure. We just simply don't know that just because we don't have enough data. So those are our reservations. And from our read of the literature, the one thing we always like to say for hypertrophy, at least, failure is very, very rarely worse. So if you're going to lean in one direction, especially given the anecdote of, a bunch of bodybuilders, Josh always likes to make sure we point out as well, there are anecdotes on the other side though, so we have to balance that out. But I would say that the vast majority of anecdotes say that training close to failure for hypertrophy is important. And so that's generally our stance on that. We are less convinced by the evidence to say that that is going to be an effective long-term strategy for all the things that I mentioned, considering regional hypertrophy and also synergistic hypertrophy. So if we're going to have a bet, what's going to be the most efficient route to getting where we want to go, which is ultimately in that period of time, getting the lifter the most jack they can in the prime movers for the exercises they want to be strong on, training closer to failure is probably a good bet in that scenario.
Okay, so sorry, 1 second. So just kind of going off that, how I personally like to periodize hypertrophy and strength phases from that context, because I do take that into account on my programming. Usually in more hypertrophy phases, I will do lower RPEs on my compound lifts. So maybe capping out like a 7 or an 8 and kind of just working within that. Maybe we progress the down sets up in terms of percentages or whatever. But basically that's what I kind of do. And I'll push my accessories to 8 to 10. Then in strength, it kind of flip that on its head a little bit more, but I know obviously utilizing some more of the, depending on the lifter, lower intra-set fatigue methods for back down volume. But I'll generally have a top set between 7 to 10, and then my accessories are a little bit lower because my whole thought process with that is there's only so much recovery and also periodization, buy-in, some psychological benefits. So that's just kind of how I apply it practically.
So Adam, question on that is, what would the load of the back offs increase from, that strength or from that hypertrophy to strength phase? Because in the hypertrophy phase, you said lower RPE, but then in the strength phase for the back offs on the main work, and then in the strength phase, you said higher RP, but also lower intra-set fatigue. So would that be due to higher loads?
Yeah. So usually what I'll do is I'll have a top set in the strength phase within like 1 to 3 reps. So usually, within that 80 to 90%, unless we're peaking. And then everything right down set, so usually be 75% plus. And then using like the accessories a little bit less as like pushing them as hard. So then we have a little bit more recovery demand. So still like, using the principle of specificity there and like the force velocity curve. But that's essentially how I like to do it. And like, it's not always like I always do like top sets or down sets. Like that's just like how I typically do it. Basically the accessory phases, because of, I believe that, in hypertrophy phases, probably, and it also depends on your leverage. Like for me, if you're just going to say, hey, Adam, we're going to do a sets of 8 on squat and your quads are going to grow a lot, I'm going to be like, really? Like my back kind of hurts a little bit when I do like high RPE squats, and like we start to bend over like a talk over, whereas like a leg press, that I can push that a lot harder, get more hypertrophy in all those private movers, and then phase potentiate that latter phase when I do push the squat a little bit harder.
Yeah. So I would just I think that checks out. And Zac mentioned some of the individualization aspect of this, and something that I've landed on with a handful of my clients is just taking a concurrent approach, in the sense that basically year round we have some degree of this quote unquote low fatigue work and some degree of these higher or highish reps, highish RPE hypertrophy work. I've just found that to work particularly well for some people. And you would be a good candidate based on what you've said here in terms of like your general squat pattern and how good of a stimulus it seems to be for your quads from a hypertrophy perspective. So yeah, I think that checks out, because basically what you're doing in the hypertrophy phases is kind of a based on how you were explaining how you program, is basically a concurrent approach, in the sense that you're doing lower fatigue back off work for the main lifts, but then you have plenty of gas left to go take those leg presses to a true 2 reps in reserve, which Zac briefly mentioned RIR accuracy at the beginning of this, is really tough. Like we talk about, hey, typically 0 to 4 reps in reserve for hypertrophy. Yeah, that's a decent practical recommendation. We also think there's potential utility to slightly higher higher RIRs, so further from failure than that. Now, to be clear, you have to make sure some other things are in place. But like, I think a lot of people that rate their leg presses at 2 reps in reserve might actually be more like 6 or 7 reps in reserve, especially when they just did, their 6 sets of 5 on their main squat work or whatever. So I think that totally checks out to me. I don't know if Zac, you have any additional thoughts?
No, I honestly don't think I have too much to add there.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys want to see like practical recommendation, I wrote like an article about that on my site. But I guess kind of moving on a little bit more, I wanted to ask about in terms of a bottom up or a top down approach with periodization and athlete management. When you guys get a client, how do you approach that individualization process? Is it more of a, we're going to, obviously we all have biases. We all have things that we think work, but there's also there's not a homogeneity of response between people. There's very heterogeneous. Like, for example, like if I give a client, it's just like, well, I'm going to do like my best guess. They say, well, based off like previous data, like what probably could work, and kind of top down initially, but then usually I'll kind of flip towards more of an emerging strategies type of an approach, where I'm like, well, what seems to work, and be okay with trying different things initially. I guess how you guys go about that whole individualization process, because I think that's probably the most nuanced aspect of programming, is we can take all of this research that we have, which is, it's there, but it's not like, and usually it's not done on like high level athletes. Like, how do you guys go about things?
Yeah, I think that's the most important part of coaching, is figuring out a system in which you can navigate the individual data that's kind of being given to you in front of you. We can talk about research, we can talk about the averages all day long. And that's an excellent place to start from. But if you don't have a coaching, framework or system in which you can individualize an athlete's training as they are moving in front of you, I think that's a big mistake. So in terms of the way that we do it, I think a lot of the chatter around emerging strategies has been super, super great for coaches in the field in general. Allows us to progress this conversation forward. So I think the first thing we like to talk about when you assemble this coaching framework or system for yourself, like we started off this podcast saying, it's just putting options back on the table. There's a ton of different ways to do this. It's not right or wrong. You don't have to do it a certain way. The way that we like to talk about it is setting a training unit, whether that be the microcycle, similar to how emerging strategies does it, whether that be a training block, like I think Bryce Lewis has talked about, that's how he kind of likes to do it, or whether that be an entire training cycle. As far as the limits of that, if you can go probably too far on either end, you don't really want to do a single training session because that can get kind of weird in terms of a management of like, how does that actually work out? I think that's originally how Bondarchuk did it with his kind of throwers in the original iterations of this. But from a powerlifting perspective, it probably makes the most sense to limit yourself in the bottom level to like a microcycle. And going farther than a single training cycle is also probably too long, because in order to actually have enough repetitions of the training unit to order to individualize things, you want to have it at a short enough frequency that you can do that and actually make changes. And of course, then all the general perils of periodization that John Kiley has wrote a ton about of super long-term planning also start to apply. So I think the first thing to say is they're not mutually exclusive. So after you've set that training unit, then it's about, establishing the kind of the training paradigm that you want to use. If you want to use periodized approach, a concurrent approach, it doesn't really matter. Whatever the way that you want to fill that training unit is, you run that training unit and have some marker of performance. For powerlifting, it's pretty easy because we can directly assess the outcome that we're interested in terms of estimated 1RM or absolute performance, whichever you want to go with. And then you can actually assess, did this training intervention go the way that I wanted it to? And if not, make adjustments and proceed. If yes, then you can continue on the road. So I think that's a really simplified way about how to go about individualization. It's really just test and have a hypothesis, you test it, and then you make, kind of adjustments to that as you go. And you can do that in a ton of different ways. Like I said, and our kind of preference is to go from that training cycle level with kind of that periodized design and make adjustments for the individual as we see fit. And that can get to a ton of different iterations of what that ultimately looks like. It's just a pretty similar starting point for most, which is where we think we can leverage the advantages of the research. But then from there, it's all about the individual data.
Do you think that effective training looks similar for most people? Like, what I mean by that is, do you think that lots of times, like, training that works well for one person, like, it's not that much different, and there's kind of just like very, very small variables that we're kind of just refining over time from a generalized template?
So I'll jump in here. That's a good question, man. I'm gonna say an initial answer that might sound different than what I actually mean, but hopefully I'll explain it on the back end and it'll all kind of make sense. So I think it's accurate to say that good training is good training. So what that means is, generally speaking, heavier loads are better for getting stronger. Generally speaking, taking a joint through a longer range of motion, especially when you reach longer muscle lengths, is going to be better for hypertrophy. I think there are generally good tenets to program design, but I think you can stray from those tenets of program design based on individual differences, and things can start to look way different from individual to individual. So on one hand, we have, yes, good training is good training. There are tenets of programming, but on the other hand, people differ a ton in terms of largely what I think it comes down to is the fatigue response from a given protocol. So I actually just posted about this yesterday. I gave the example of somebody that is generally experiences less fatigue or just subjectively feels less beat up from heavy loads, grindy reps with 90% plus. Feed that to them. Like, if there's no downside, just give it to them. Like, you don't need to go do a 8-week block of just sets of 8 for the sake of hypertrophy. Like, you should probably feed that to them, because there's really no downside. But for another person who gets beat up from touching, 90% plus, yes, of course, we should probably discuss, hey, if you expose them to it more, they're gonna tolerate it better. But let's just say, generally speaking, you went down that path, they still get beat up from it. Maybe their top set exposures are a little bit later, right? Because still, top set exposures are going to be important. Touching heavy loads are going to be important for maximal strength, but the fatigue cost for them is a little bit greater. So thus you kind of rein that back. So it's all a give and a take. So yes, good training is good training. Heavier loads, better for strength. However, individual differences in their response to that given tenet of programming can lead you down wildly different paths. So when you were talking about individualization, and top down versus bottom up, I think this is exactly, I think this circles back perfectly, right? From the top down perspective, we can say, hey, in general, as you go from further out from a test to closer to a test, we want to see decreasing levels of intra-set fatigue, because that's going to allow you to maximize your peak intensity exposures a little bit more. And it's a little bit more specific for strength. But to what degree that occurs, on what exercises that occur, et cetera, is all subject to individualization. So I hope that kind of makes sense of how, yes, good training is good training, but also individual A's training that I land on for them after working with them for 2 years versus individuals B can be totally different. So like on my client roster, the people that I've strayed from, like what I would say is like my quote unquote, like, if I were to just program for an average person, the people that are furthest from that are the people I've been working with the longest, because we've just been led down a certain path based on their response. So hopefully that makes some sense. Adam, let me know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of really good sense. I guess the biggest thing that I got from there is, each individual has a certain stress bucket, and we're trying to define like what is the best way to maximize that productive training dose. And say, like the person has a certain amount of volume requirements. It's how are we allocating that volume
right on
specifically?
I'll go ahead, Josh. I got a practical example to give, but
yeah, super quickly. That's the same idea behind periodization too, right? Where we're talking about hypertrophy being very important for long-term strength, right? So thus we're going to allocate our bucket a little bit more towards, hey, high RPs. Yes, there's going to be a fatigue cost to this, but we're really hedging our bets towards hypertrophy because that's a good investment. But hey, we're 5 weeks out now. Yes, we'd still like to see some muscle growth, but that's not the primary focus right now. So we're going to allocate our recovery bucket towards heavier loads, higher peak intensities, et cetera. So that really is what all of training comes down to, whether it's the tenets of periodization that we've kind of landed on, or it's individualization. So Zach,
yeah, the thing I was like a practical example of this I was going to paint was like, while there are, pretty a wide degree of anecdotes of people talking about, this lifter responds to XYZ training, this lifter responds to ABC training, and they're very, very different. I think if you're able to take a step back, and like you said, Adam, like think about this metaphorical bucket that we're ultimately shooting for. I am hard pressed to think of a coach that has ever found somebody that just really responds for strength to 30% of one round. Like that just doesn't, you know what I mean? Like it doesn't happen as far as I'm aware. Now, maybe there are people out there that for whatever reason have really responded to that. But like, if you are able to take a step back out and you just take these kind of principles and take them to the extreme, which isn't necessarily what people are advocating for, but it helps you think through it. Like, I don't think that the wide degree of response to the point where it's not even what you would expect really happens. What happens is exactly what Josh said. When I give lifter A dose of training at 75%, they don't seem to be too perturbed in terms of fatigue. But when I give lifter B a dose of training at 75%, they are very fatigued. And that's not necessarily bad in the acute, but then when we try to do the same amount of training volume, now the total dose that they can handle goes down. And then that is probably ultimately what we're shooting for to make adaptations over time and ultimately improve. So I still think that there are these metaphorical relationships for these variables that are quote unquote optimal. but the individual context and how they respond from a stimulus to fatigue ratio, to steal that term, on each one of those, including psychology, including training volume, including rest periods, including exercise selection, depending on leverages, literally every variable you can possibly think of. That stimulus to fatigue ratio impacts ultimately the configuration of variables that is going to lead to the best amount of dose in that bucket. But it's not necessarily that lifter uniquely only responds to a given percentage of 1RM. It's just the overall impact of all the variables in order to have this adaptive dose. And the other thing I just made a post about recently, it's not like there's just one training program that can work for an individual. There's probably multiple configurations of each of these variables that can lead to a similar dose in that bucket. So you could maybe train with really high loads, but low volume and all those things. And I think that kind of explains the contrasting anecdotes of a ton of lifters over time. You have the group that trains super, super heavy and super, super low volume. You have the group that train super high volume, but a ton of low fatiguing exercises. That to me kind of fits in with everything. When we have these variables that we can pull on in different directions, then it just becomes about talking about preference, talking about specificity to the task, and talking about, like Josh said, in terms of periodization, what makes sense in terms of efficiency at that time in your training cycle. But hopefully that kind of paints a little bit more picture there.
I like that because I guess why I was kind of thinking about during that is I guess the quote unquote ideal place to go with because ideally clients should work with coaches for a extended period of time. I think that if you choose a coach, it should be a long-term plan. It should be a long-term investment. Is only finding different iterations of programming. Like you just said, there's not just one way to program. There could be multiple ways that do work for that client. And maybe because we have some research that this novelty and periodization, it can help with that, long-term progress. Maybe somebody's low diminishing returns with one certain training approach. But we know from data over time that we've collected with this lifter, this approach also works well and is sufficiently novel enough to help improve that strength response. Because I know that lots of times, we'll have this caveat. Well, how do we know if it's just that you change it up? It's I don't think that really matters. I think if we're making progress towards the goal, that's really what matters.
And I think two things to consider there, especially from a long-term perspective. We know monotony and strain is probably not good for injury management. And the lifters that are going to get the strongest are the ones that can stay healthy and train hard for the longest period of time. And I think that's generally Josh and I's. We don't think periodization is magic. We don't think it's going to, boost your strength gains a ton inherently. We just think it's a safe bet to switch things up every now and again to decrease some of that monotony and strain, especially psychologically, and allow people to kind of mix things up so they can continue to train hard. Like we talked about, if we're moving our psychological goal to, man, I'm going to the gym today, I'm going to crush these leg presses at a true 2 RIR, and I'm going to really know what that feels like. 2 in a strength block, I'm going to max out this single out at 8 to 9 RP and really maximize my performance today. To an outsider that doesn't, kind of fit into the powerlifting or strength sport community, that's just lifting weights to them. But to us, that's kind of a different psychological goal that I think can pay dividends in the long run. Just those slight switches in tasks to allow you to continue to stay healthy by switching things up every now and again, by decreasing that psychological strain and allowing you just to continue to have fun in the gym, because the people that are the biggest and the strongest are the ones that are training the longest.
Josh, you have anything to add there?
No, man, I think Zac can drop the mic right there. And
yeah. Well, I guess I have one last kind of a more fun question. This is something I was actually talking with my friend, Aiden Rader, who's I don't know if you guys know him, super strong teenager, squatted 600 pounds at 19 years old.
Aiden's very strong.
Yeah. We were on the phone last night, actually talking about this podcast and what questions that he had, and we were just shooting back and forth, just some of our own questions related to training. And he had a really good question, and this was something that I thought would be kind of cool to ask you guys as a final sign-off question. So here's the scenario. Say you have a lifter who is moving up a weight class, and they've historically responded well to a particular training dose. Let's say in that first scenario, would you add volume because they are having more, maybe their stress bucket is increasing, and if you would do so, how would you do that to maybe, take advantage of the upper weight class, maybe you can take advantage of a little bit more of a heightened rate of adaptation, or would you stay at the same? Versus contrarily, say you have a lifter who is also going to be moving up a weight class, but they've been feeling beat up by their previous training dose that they were using, but maybe they were just in the weight class that just wasn't ideal for them. They're just too small. Would you change the training dose then, like lower it down, or how would you go about individualizing? I guess, how does volume kind of change as you like move up a weight class?
Yeah, I'll kick this one off and then pass it over to you, Zach. So this actually ties in really well with what we've been talking about in terms of pairing, top-down periodization tenets that we've kind of landed on with bottom-up individualization. And the short answer of how I personally approach it is I might do that, but I would probably not do it proactively. So I would wait until until it's clear that we should, or we can, or we would probably benefit from bumping up the training volume. So what I mean by that is let's say we make a change, and or let's say there's a change in their general body weight trends, right? Okay, now we're going to be gaining about a pound to a pound and a half a month. Okay, cool. Let's more or less keep the overall training stress the same. And then if by the end of this training cycle or the end of this block, it's very clear that you can handle more and you're not progressing, or we feel like we could definitely get a faster rate of progression, sure, we can add it. But in general, I avoid trying to predict the future. And I think that's something we've definitely stolen from, the emerging strategies concepts, is like in general, be reactive and follow the response. Yes, you're going to have to use your subjective input, because at the end of the day, right, like we're making that decision to go up in training volume because we know they are better fed, for example. So that's my answer, is potentially, but probably not proactively.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree. I think primarily the way I view it is that training is the stimulus that you're getting for muscle growth. The position of your nutrition is just going to manipulate the yield of what you're getting from your training. So, full disclosure, not a nutrition expert, but that is the way I understand it from the secondhand sources that I trust. But that is primarily the way that I view it. So you have somebody that is, stable in their weight. Training is still the stimulus that's going to cause the adaptations ultimately. But if we put them in a surplus, they're probably going to be gaining more muscle than if they weren't. And if you put them in the deficit, probably less so. So does that allow them to recover from a little bit more training volume? Potentially, like Josh said. Then the question starts to become, okay, again, what is the primary thing we want to do in the long run here? Stay healthy. If I jack up their training dose 20% or whatever, is that in that short of time, is that going to impact my hypertrophy to a degree that is going to outpace the potential injury, especially if you kind of don't know. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And especially if somebody's beat up and they're moving into a surplus, I would absolutely still probably manipulate their training dose a little bit down to make sure that they're feeling recovered. And then we can always go up again from there. But if anybody's ever feeling beat up, I am not very hesitant to manipulate things down a little bit to make sure that they're feeling recovered and moving forward.
One quick caveat, super quick, just to be clear, is this would assume it's within like a recommended rate of gain or a recommended like rate of weight loss, right? If somebody's going to go do a dreamer bulk, and you can maybe do it proactively, but we wouldn't recommend we wouldn't advise somebody to gain at that insane at an insane rate like that.
83 is a super heavyweight.
Yeah, if you're super heavyweight and works there was a Mike Israel, smoke your sausage, cigars, whatever some of the super heavyweights do. And
that's a cool question though. That's a cool question. I didn't thought about that in that way, but yeah, that I think proactive increases or decreases in things is kind of like Josh said, you're predicting the future, and every time we've tried to do that in the past, it generally doesn't end up with favorable results.
Yeah, I agree. With my own anecdotal experience, all I've seen is usually, say if the lifter does come to me and they have a little bit more of, they've been responding really, really well to their training. They just they're 6 feet. Like in my case, I'm 6 feet tall. Probably being 180, 181 probably isn't very good. for my long-term strength potential, I'll probably need to be 200 pounds plus to really be the best powerlifter I can. Usually I found with most people going up a weight class and going up, within the recommended weight race of gain, usually they just respond and adapt better. Potentially can put on some more muscle mass and whatnot. And I guess just to close this off, Kendrick Kwan was on my last podcast. We were talking about this in the last part, and basically how do you know like when you should move up a weight class and whatnot. He's like, honestly, like I kind of have the mindset of I'm going to constantly have my athletes trying to gain like 0.5 1.5% of body weight per week over time. And then as soon as it kind of starts to like where the fat gain kind of seems to outpace the muscle growth, and like they're not really getting that much benefit from that surplus, I know I'm probably closer to their weight class they should probably be at. Until then, you just keep gaining weight for like perma bulk. So
yeah, man. I mean, so many people like just need to, I've definitely run into it quite frequently where you just need to have that talk like, hey, at your current body weight, like we'll see some strength gains, but we're gonna have to swallow that pill and either commit to getting down to a body weight or a level of body fat which you're ready to be in a sustained calorie surplus, or just enter that calorie surplus. Because I think a ton of people just end up with 1 foot in and 1 foot out.
Yeah.
So I'm always having that conversation of like, hey, like we just need to decide. Like if you're 3 weeks into your surplus, you're gonna be like, man, should have entered that deficit. If you're 3 weeks into that deficit, you're like, man,
yeah,
I would love some
I'm
extra calories.
tired, I'm sore, I want donuts.
Yeah. So Kendrick, I don't know him super well personally, but everything I've seen from him is awesome, and I think I would definitely agree with that. That generally speaking, a lot of people need to swallow that pill, I think.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Right, guys. Well, we're coming up on the hour, so I want to thank you so much for coming on, donating your time. Where can people find you?
Go for it, Zach. You always kick this to me, so it's your turn.
Yeah, I always forget where to start. Well, Adam, thank you very much for having us on, dude. It was a blast. Really enjoyed your questions. So you can find us on our website. So that would be data-drivenstrength.com. We post some articles there, some good stuff like that. And then you can also look us up on Instagram. We post like infographics and research reviews and whatnot at Zac, ZAC data driven strength, Josh data driven strength, and Jake data driven strength. Check us out there, and hopefully we're not too annoying.
Well, definitely go follow them. They are spitting out some really, really good information. So yeah, again, thank you guys so much for listening to the podcast, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.